All right, well, I just got back from Thanksgiving, went back home, had a great time seeing the family, got to go out and do a little bit of hunting. The 7 PRC that I put together performed fantastic. I ended up having a really good hunting season, got 2 deer. The first night I was out there, I got a really nice 8-point. And then a couple nights later, I got another deer and shot it at about 215 yards. And again, that 7 PRC just performed outstanding. So this is a shoulder off of the second deer that I got last week. And if you've done any deer hunting, this is one of the worst pieces to deal with, shoulders, because they're very stringy. There's bones in here with shoulder blades, tons of tendons, and there's not a ton of meat. So shoulders take a lot of work. And what I have kind of come to over the past few years is that that's not really worth it. Doing all that processing, there's an easier way. And so in this video, I'm going to show you how I handle deer shoulder, and that is to make barbacoa, where I'm just going to put this in a slow cooker with a bunch of peppers. And by the time this thing is done, we'll just be able to pull the bones out, shred the meat, and then you can make tacos or bowls or whatever else you want with that barbacoa base. Now, barbacoa really is just slow cooked meat, and so I'm going to use deer shoulder, but if you want to use like chuck or some other kind of fatty cut of beef or something like that, it's really suitable for that too. I'm doing this with deer shoulder because deer shoulder, again, is one of those things that is a real problem if you're a hunter. Now, if you shoot a really big deer, or you're up in like Wisconsin and shoot a button buck, you might have trouble getting that in your slow cooker. Well, don't be afraid to cut it up so that it fits, because again, the point here is it's all going to cook down and be able to be shredded. You don't have to get it all in one nice pretty piece. The other thing I'll say is that I'm using a lot of different peppers and stuff. The real big important piece are the chipotles and adobo. Everything else you can kind of mix and match a little bit. So if you want to use jalapenos, you can probably use jalapenos. If you want to use fresh peppers instead of canned peppers, because I've got a lot of different canned peppers, you can do a lot of different stuff with this and it's still going to turn out being pretty good. To me, the big important pieces are the meat. You gotta have enough fat. You want your chipotle in adobo sauce, and the vinegar. You want apple cider vinegar with some beef stock or some sort of bullion. Those are the real main components of flavor in this dish. I'm gonna be using a slow cooker. You can also do this in a Dutch oven if you want. I find the slow cooker is just much more efficient for this because it doesn't heat the whole house. You will have to cook this for 6 to 10 hours, depending on what you're doing. I'm gonna take and just put a very good drizzle of olive oil in the bottom of this thing. And then I'm just gonna drop the whole shoulder in here. So you need 1 onion. This one's maybe a little bigger than is necessary, but a decent size onion. And you don't have to be super careful because this is all gonna cook down. So basically, I'm just gonna take this thing and chunk it up. So again, they don't have to be too fine of chunks because this is gonna cook for a long time and the onion's gonna cook down quite a bit. On garlic, you're just gonna garlic to taste. I like pretty heavy garlic, so I've got 5 good sized cloves, and the way I deal with these is I'm just gonna cut off the dry end. Then I just take them and I smash them. And once you crush these down, so usually if you do a good job, the garlic will just fall right out. So I'm just gonna give it a rough chop, get it into slightly smaller pieces. You don't have to go super crazy. It doesn't have to be minced or anything. Just again, get it in, I don't know, 1/4 inch, 3/8 inch chunks, something like that. Nothing too fine, and that's gonna be plenty. You could, in theory, use pre-minced garlic if you wanted. You know, fresh garlic is better, but I don't wanna tell anybody that they can't use pre-minced garlic. I've done it before. It's just not quite as good. So next up, I've got some Ancho chilies, and I'm gonna do a few of these. You don't need a ton, and actually that one's pretty big. So I'll do like a couple of small ones in this big one, and that'll be plenty. You don't have to use anchos. You can also use something like a Guajillo or something in that kind of medium to mild range as far as peppers. So the way I do these, you wanna get all the seeds out, and these are pretty leathery. So you can usually just open them up and pull these seeds out. Now, once I've got these de-seeded, I usually just kind of roll them up and then just almost like a julienne. They don't have to be super tiny, but you don't want big, long, stringy strips of pepper. So I usually do, something like that, and that'll be fine enough. All right, and the very last vegetable that you really need to worry about are limes. So I've got some key limes. That's just what I had. You can also use bottled lime juice if that's all you got. Again, this is one of those deals where, sure, fresh is better, but, don't let that bother you if all you've got is just something out of a bottle. That'll be plenty fine. So I'm going to just go ahead and split these, and that's going to be our prepped vegetables for this. All right, so then I've got my onions and garlic. All right, now I've got the dried peppers that I cut up. So for the limes, I tend to go ahead and squeeze them and get the juice out and then just go ahead and throw them in there because you'll be able to pick these out later pretty easily, but that'll get a very good flavor in there. So next up, I'm gonna add a big handful of fresh oregano. If you don't have fresh oregano, that's okay. You can use dried oregano, probably a good couple of teaspoons of dried oregano. Will do it. I have fresh, so I'm going to use fresh, and I just, again, throw it all in there. Basically, what's going to happen with fresh oregano, it's going to cook down, the leaves are going to come out, and you're going to be able to just pull these stems out later. Next up, taco seasoning. I have not found that the brand really matters that much. And now we're going to start adding canned peppers. Now, this is where, again, you can go crazy a bunch of different ways with this. The important things, again, to me, chipotles and adobo, that's kind of the main flavor base here. I'm also going to add a can of Rotel, some mild green diced chilies, and some verde salsa. And this I also think is pretty important because you kind of want some tomatillo in there, and the verde salsa will have a pretty good amount of that. And so that's where I'm going to get that kind of flavor in here. So there's our main components. Now we got to add liquid. I'm going to be using apple cider vinegar. A lot of the recipes, you'll also see beef stock in here, and so I don't have beef stock a lot of the times, and so what I'm going to use is a little bit of better than bullion. This stuff is fantastic. It keeps for a long time in the fridge. So I do a good teaspoon and a half of better than bullion in there, and whenever all this liquid cooks down, that's going to give it the equivalent of having beef stock in it. So you can kind of do one or the other. If you use beef stock, you want to use maybe about a pint of beef stock. Use better than bullion, you do like a teaspoon and a half of better than bullion in here. Again, it's not that precise. You can kind of do what you want, but you do want something in there, either, again, beef stock or bullion. Now, for the vinegar, again, I'm using apple cider vinegar. That is, to me, the only one that you really want to use. You don't want to use just regular distilled white vinegar. You probably could. I don't know. I really like the way it turns out with this. And then I use these cans just to get a little bit more of the flavor out of the cans. And I'm going to add at least 2 cups of this vinegar in here. As you use this recipe, you kind of get used to how much liquid you need in here. It can vary depending on the size of the shoulder. So again, I'm going to do a good 2 cups. If you need more liquid, you can add more liquid. You will get a lot out of the canned peppers kind of cooking down. That'll also give you liquid. And if you find it's too acidic, again, you can also add some other stuff. You can reduce the amount of vinegar. You can switch out some beef stock. The way I would do it like this, if I wanted it a little less, if I'm using that better than bullion, I'd put in maybe some water to cut it down. So there I just added about a half a can of water. And so now I've got basically everything, and now we're into the optional territory, things that you don't really have to do, but you can, just kind of some slight modification to the recipe. So one thing you could add, a couple of bay leaves, never hurt anything. A little bit of cumin is always nice. And then something that can help if you find that, again, the acidity and the flavors are a little overpowering, just take about this much brown sugar, which this is maybe a little over a teaspoon. This will soften the flavor just a little bit and add just a hint of sweetness. You don't want to go overboard with this. So again, this is optional. You can leave it out completely. Now, that's it for the way I make this. You can add like black pepper to this. I don't really find that adds a lot. It gets lost in there to me. You also notice that I did not add any salt. One thing to be careful about, I wouldn't add salt on the front end because you're getting a lot of sodium out of those canned peppers. So if you did use canned peppers, you use fresh peppers, that might change things. You might need to add salt. But the Rotel that I used, that had salt in it. The chipotles that I used, those had salt in it. The verde salsa, that had salt in it. So I tend to hesitate on adding salt until this is cooked down quite a bit. Then you can taste it and see if you need to add salt. So at this point, it's just put it in a slow cooker. You're gonna need probably at least 6 hours on high and probably 8+ hours on low, but you do want to check it every now and then, stir everything to make everything kind of mix together after a few hours once it's got good and hot, but it does take a while to do this. So let me move this over the slow cooker and we'll come back once it's a little ways down the road. All right, we're a couple hours in here, so I'm gonna just stir this in. Usually do this a couple times during the cook, make sure everything stays good and mixed together. One thing I forgot earlier that I do like to do sometimes is chuck in some extra beef fat. So I just save some beef trimmings from whenever you do a brisket, or sometimes I trim up steaks, and I like to save that good fat, and that adds just a bit more flavor to everything. That usually renders down good enough that it'll basically just disappear in there. I do that because this deer does end up being a pretty lean meat, so adding a little bit of extra fat tends to help. We're good, probably 7 hours, close to it, on high, and so you can see that meat is really shredding good. And again, the whole point of this is to make it easy to deal with a shoulder, and there you go. You can see, man, those bones just come right out. This one may need just a touch longer, not much. I mean, there's your main shoulder blade. See that meat just pulls right apart, and that's what we'll be doing. We'll be shredding this thing. All right, so there's all the bones and good stuff pulled out. Again, makes it really easy to deal with. I'm gonna turn it down to low and let it cook for maybe another hour. Just about right, but I feel like right now it needs just a bit more before it's totally ready. All right, and she's done. So there, as you can see, all the tough, stringy meat of that shoulder has been really rendered down. Super tender. What I usually do at this point is I'm going to put this in the refrigerator overnight. It tends to just kind of settle everything in, mellow all the flavors, blend everything together. It can be a little sharp and acidic if you eat it fresh. I do find that letting it sit for a night does really help kind of improve the overall flavor. So that's what I'm going to do, and then tomorrow we'll pull it out and it'll be ready to eat. Well, it's been a day. Overnight in the fridge, this stuff ought to mellowed out pretty good. So you can see we got a pretty good amount of fat there on top. If you want to skim it, you can. I actually think the fat is where a lot of the flavor is, so I'm going to leave it. Now, I'm going to show you basically what I usually do. Take some of this, reheat it, and I've got the old Tiger rice cooker here. These are fantastic. And so I'm just going to put some of this over rice. Again, this stuff is suitable for tacos, burrito filling. You can eat it by itself. It's pretty darn stout if you just eat it straight. So I find that having it, over something in a taco with, onions and cilantro and cheese, or maybe in a bowl with some rice and sour cream and cheese or something, maybe a little Fritos crackled up in there for some texture. It helps reduce the strength of the flavor because, again, man, this stuff is a absolute flavor bomb. Let's get this little cheese on there. The rice obviously will also help this stretch out on meals. So if you're feeding a bunch of people, you mix up a good batch of rice, pot of this, you can feed a whole bunch of people off of one deer shoulder. All right, so the main flavor profiles that you're going to get out of this, a lot of good acidity from that apple cider vinegar and the citrus from that lime. I'd say that's kind of the first major flavor, is that kind of acidity. You've also got a really good amount of savory, obviously from the deer meat itself, although it's not gamey because there's so many other strong flavors that the slight gaminess that some people don't like in wild game isn't strongly present because of everything else that's in this dish. But you're kind of left with that savory, meaty flavor. There's a little bit of spiciness, but it's not too hot. So this is not as hot as like buffalo wings or something like that. There's just a good amount of spice without being overpowering. So by the end of the bowl, you might have a bit of a runny nose, but it's not going to be that bad. And you really do get a lot of those different components. The adobo, the chilies, they're all kind of in there. And so you really do get a very, very strong flavor out of this but you can taste all the components. It's definitely not a one-note dish, and so that's why it's the only way that I really deal with a deer shoulder anymore. It solves a lot of the problems of working up the actual meat itself because, well, you just don't really have to process anything. It's easy because you just throw everything in a pot and cook it up. You get really great, strong flavors. It makes a lot of food, and it's absolutely delicious. But that's going to be it for this video. If you've got any feedback, comments, or questions, or if anybody makes this and you want to tell me how much it sucks, feel free to leave those in a comment down below. As always, I appreciate your time. Thanks.